Welcome to Science Matters Colorado, the podcast that explores the environmental issues shaping our beautiful state. I am your host, Alex Hippenhammer. Today, I am honored to share a deeply candid and illuminating conversation with Dustin Freyta, an Indigenous American and one of the leading voices at Sacred Water Mountain Society based in Taos, New Mexico. Sacred Water Mountain Society is centered on the revitalization of an ancient indigenous practice known as water planting, a sophisticated method of land and water stewardship that has largely disappeared from public awareness, though its physical traces remain hidden in plain sight across the landscape. Dustin brings not only extraordinary knowledge of indigenous histories, including the often overlooked legacy of slavery and oppression across the Americas, but also a personal story that is just as remarkable. From surviving the generational impacts of colonial marginalization to a period of solitude in the wilderness of Colorado, Dustin's path has been one of reclamation, resilience, and return. What emerges is a reimagining of relationship with the natural world, one rooted in ancestral wisdom and lived through an unflinching commitment to land-based practices. This conversation is frank, sometimes unsettling, and always grounded in truth. Dustin does not claim to speak for any tribe or nation. His heritage includes Apache, Comanche, and Pueblo ancestry, but the insights he offers are the result of hard-earned experience and deep research. I'm grateful for his willingness to share them. Wherever you're listening, I hope this episode serves a reminder of who the original stewards of this land are. For those of us in Colorado, that includes the Ute, specifically the Southern Ute Indian tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, as well as the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Apache, Shoshone, Comanche, Kiowa, and Navajo peoples. There is much to learn still from those who have long held knowledge of how to live in balance with the land. I hope this conversation challenges, inspires, and calls you towards that deeper listening. Here's my conversation with Dustin Freyta. So to start off, can you tell me about yourself? Like, where are you at right now? And tell me a little bit about your roots and your background.
Right now, I'm in Taos, New Mexico. I live outside of Taos, New Mexico. My family's originally from the Taos territory. A lot of my ancestors come from indigenous slavery. We're a mixture of Apache, Comanche, Pueblo, Spanish, Portuguese, and white Americans. So we're really, I come from a really diverse family, but also a deep culture here. And, being a descendant of indigenous slaves, me and my community were not recognized, federally recognized indigenous, but we are recognized by the state of New Mexico and by ourselves and each other. But that's a little background on me. And so, yeah.
For most people, I think they probably don't know much about indigenous slavery, and you were telling me a little bit about that in our last conversation. So can you kind of just explain a little bit about the history of that? Where are you talking about in terms of where did indigenous slavery happen and where did it happen to your family? If you don't mind sharing about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, indigenous slavery started the Native American continental indigenous slavery started when contact happened in the 1490s. And it affected every part of this land from South America all the way through North America. All the indigenous people were affected and captured and taken different places as slaves since the late 1400s until the 1900s. There were the Ford plant that makes Ford vehicles. They had a rubber plantation in the Amazon jungles in the mid 1900s where they enslaved indigenous people. So it's very broad, very long term. Specifically for my family, our family were taken, uh, some of them initially by the Spanish as slaves, and were enslaved to the Catholic Church in different means. And then again, my family was enslaved by the United States, all from New Mexico, Colorado territory. Um, and from documents, my family remained in slavery until the 1880s in southern Colorado. And we've heard of incidences where in southern Colorado, indigenous people remained slaves until the 1920s and 30s. Um, a lot of people with our current education and culture, the American education system, they make it seem like indigenous slavery ended in the 1500s, and our ancestors were replaced by African slaves, um, which isn't completely wrong, but here in the Southwest, Southern Colorado, especially, indigenous slavery continued after the Civil War.
And what was the term for your ancestors in particular?
Well, the Spanish term for us, there were many, but one of the most recognized today is Genisiro, and it's kind of the name we're taking to kind of stand up out of the abyss and say, hey, we're still here. This is who we are. And during the Mexico Revolution against Spain, the fight for Mexico's independence from Spain, Mexico abolished slavery. And so the period of the 1820s until the 1840s, we were freed from slavery. But then a lot of people were put back into slavery by the United States. The United States didn't keep any records as far as with the name Genisiro like the Spaniards did. But the United States changed the name to indentured servitude, or for young boys, they would be called laborers. You know,
Mm-hmm.
So um, my my fourth great grandmother, she was sold into slavery as an old woman at the end of the 1870s and died in slavery. And my uh, third great grandfather was born a slave and sold as a 12-year-old boy to the St. Viron land grant in southern Colorado, um, where a lot of the other non-white population there around Trinidad, throughout the San Luis Valley, still to this day, the majority of what's considered Hispano or Chicano families are descendants of indigenous slavery.
You said your fourth great grandfather was sold to a land grant. Does that mean he was working for under this indentured servitude for the federal government, or was it individual people?
So from the Taos County probate records that I've observed, um, it was my fourth great grandmother. Her name was Luz Tafoya, and she was forced into indentured servitude to the Vigil family here in Taos. And at the same time, she had custody of her grandkids, and her grandkids, which was my third great grandfather,
Okay.
Roberto Freyta. Roberto Freyta was the first one to have our last name, Freyta.
Mm-hmm.
And he was sold along with his siblings, who are all underage. He was the oldest, he was 12. But him and his siblings and a Ute woman who ended up carrying the name Juana Freyta, her and her two sons were put together with my grandpa and his siblings, and together they were sent to the St. Viron land grant. I assume to the St. Viron family, but I'm not 100% sure. But we have documents that specify at 12 years old he was a laborer on their ranch.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, I can't say that I have heard about this history until you started telling me about it. Um, and so you said the Hanisiro word is um, sort of derogatory, but it's also a way of kind of reclaiming that history because that's really the only documentation that you have of this history is using that word. So
Well,
it's yeah.
yeah, I mean, there was a lot of different words used. One of them was Kritos, and Kritos referred specifically to the natives that were slaves to the church.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in the form of a nun or
Mm-hmm.
a church servant. But collectively, there's many communities in New Mexico and Colorado that are purely Hanisiro communities,
Mm.
and they were descendants of indigenous slaves that were given some land to be a buffer between the tribes and the colonials, the more colonial communities.
Mm. Okay.
And so, for example, today, Ranchos de Taos is a Hanisiro community in its root. Um, uh, Chamayo, New Mexico, is a Hanisiro community in its roots.
Mm.
Cuesta, New Mexico, San Luis, Colorado.
Really?
Um, yeah,
Mm.
these are, Hanisiro communities in the roots on up into, Pueblo, Colorado.
Okay.
A large population of Pueblo, Colorado comes from indigenous slaves,
Mm.
and on up into Denver.
Mm.
A huge portion of Denver. Um, a lot of people we would call Mexicans, or like Hispanos or Chicanos.
Mm-hmm.
They're descendants of indigenous slaves
Mm.
who, over time, kept getting displaced,
Yeah.
and had to move to the cities, to find work and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that once they were
Yeah.
freed.
Right. So when I was talking to you last time we chatted, you were telling me about some of the practices that you do at the Sacred Water Mountain Society, and I'm curious, like, given this history um, with indigenous slavery um, here in Colorado and New Mexico, you're are these practices something that you've had to sort of like rediscover on your own, or was your family able to still pass down this knowledge when it comes to things like water planting specifically, but just more generally, is this something that you've had to like really work to kind of discover? Was this lost through indigenous slavery, or was your family still able to pass these traditions and this knowledge down?
So we lost a lot. Um, the only thing my family didn't lose is knowledge of who we came from.
Mm.
Um, that's the main thing we didn't lose, was knowledge of who we came from. And it seems like from the history of the older people in my family, there was a lot of land knowledge retained, as far as, you know, we know the land very well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we also know the medicines and plants pretty well too,
Mm-hmm.
and animals. Um, but overall, the knowledge of planting water is something I had to find again, for and I didn't even knew it existed in the scale and form that I speak of.
Mm.
Um, it was my great uncle, who's still alive. His name is Carlos Frankie Freyta. He lives in Denver, actually.
Okay.
And he's in his 90s now.
Oh wow.
He's one of our oldest living memories, for our family now. And he told me of the places where our family used to live, and a lot of these places are occupied now, or a lot of these places are national forest.
Mm.
But when I found myself homeless as a young man, I chose to go to these places and, live in the national forest instead of living on the streets, which I did live on the streets for a while. But eventually I found myself living in these places associated with my family history. And these places are beautiful,
Mm.
especially the ones in the national forest,
Mm.
that are kind of protected. Um, but over the years of living in these places, the land started to reveal itself, things started to reveal itself, started having communications with the land, and over time I started seeing a pattern, and I could tell what it was doing. It's catching water, it's rehydrating the land, but it really took me about, let's say, 5 years to really put it all together. And I started exploring other places in association, uh, and on different sides of the valley, different mountain ranges. And I started finding the same thing in all these places. And so at that moment, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I knew it was something bigger. And over the years, I've put it together to understand, what I call planting water, which is ultimately, catching all the runoff from snowmelt, from monsoons, mainly in mountainous areas, uh, places with slopes and grades where a lot of runoff happens. And it's mainly focusing on the places to where the runoff is, heavy enough to cause some sort of erosion or cut. And so in studying these ancient planting water systems, they weren't just ca- catching water and recharging groundwater and creating wet landscape, you know, profitable for all life. Um, but on the scale they were doing this work, they were even circulating water in the watershed. Taking normal runoff water and not just catching it and sinking it in, but also taking it back up the watershed.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's really extensive. It's
Mm.
really, really impressive on an engineering scale.
Mm-hmm.
It's a masterful feat of engineering
Mm-hmm.
on, on a scale that I don't see in our current textbooks or current uh, permaculture, or these types of things. I don't see what these ancient planting water systems are doing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see it being taught anywhere. So we've been studying these ancient systems, uh, also trying to collect data on them, to protect them, to understand them, and also to be able to replicate them
Mm.
in places that have been really demolished, or you know places that have been desertified.
Mm. Right. So you were talking about how these catchment technologies, uh, water planting, it does replenish groundwater. It does provide these different ecosystem services. Like I imagine it's kind of like what Ruth is doing with ecologic and trying to restore beaver habitat probably has similar benefits within the watershed, kind of restoring like biodiversity. Um, but you said it's even more than that. So I'm trying to wrap my head around like what's when you talk about scale, are you talking about just how many of these uh, I don't know what you call them. Ruth referred to them as berms. Are you talking about how many of these berms there are? Are you also talking about the size of these berms, or is it just kind of like they're the network of them is so extensive that it has this effect of like cycling the water through the watershed. I can't imagine how that works exactly for it to go up, back up the mountain. Like that's kind of mind blowing. But yeah, can you tell me like what does that look like when you talk about scale?
It kind of all of the above.
Okay, really?
I mean, without seeing these places,
Mm,
you really can't imagine.
okay, okay.
But once you've walked top to bottom
Mm,
and side to side, a whole system, which could stretch a mile or
mm,
it could stretch many miles.
mm,
I mean, it could literally. I've seen entire mountains that have been sculpted.
mm,
You know, that's why we're trying to collect data on this stuff because it's really hard to describe,
mm.
and the scale is so massive that we really need some experts who can measure water.
Yeah.
Because one, even the smallest system, it's just a part of a greater system.
Mm-hmm.
But even the smallest ones, they're annually catching and moving millions of gallons of water
Mm.
around the watershed and putting it into the mountain.
Wow.
Millions of gallons. I mean, it's it on a full system scale, we're talking trillions of gallons.
Mm-hmm.
You know, entire rivers, are being put into the mountain so that a river can come out of the mountain.
And when you're talking about this, you're describing just kind of changing the typology of the land. You're not talking about infrastructure that requires like pipes or anything like that to move the groundwater. It's literally just changing the land to move the water around, right?
So when you see these systems, especially the ones that are well preserved, still functioning, you really see the strategy. You really see, that these things were laid out and put together from a real mastermind,
Mm,
master engineering point of view.
mm,
You know, they're not just built to scale with the terrain around them. They're built to scale to deal with the amount of water.
mm.
You know, um, and there's all sorts of different ways it looks depending on the land and how much water there is, and how the water moves on the land. So there's many variations of work, techniques,
Mm-hmm.
um, but they're all done. I mean, remind you, this is humans that didn't have heavy equipment. They didn't have modern tools,
Mm-hmm.
and the precision that these structures are built with, uh, you know, it's impressive. It's just as impressive as the stonework you see at Machu Picchu.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people are always impressed at how close the stones fit and how precise everything is. Well, that's what I'm seeing in this work, even though it's not stonework.
Mm-hmm.
It's the detail in these structures and how it moves the water and handles the water. You can tell it's a mastermind.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, capabilities we don't have or use, today. And they were just purely using what was provided
Yeah.
there there in the general area.
Yeah.
They weren't transporting things anywhere. At most, I determined that they would move, they wouldn't move any further than 20 feet
Mm-hmm.
from where they're working to gather the material they need
Mm.
to do the job.
Mm.
And when you work with the land and you work with the water, it really maximizes work with less effort.
Mm. Right.
And so in our American way of thinking, we think we put more in, we get more out.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's true, but that's kind of why everything's falling apart right
Yeah.
now is
Right.
we put so much in
Yeah.
and we're not getting not as much out, right?
Right. Yeah.
Even the agriculture industry is subsidized
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
insurance policies because you're having to invest $1 million to start a farm,
Yeah.
and that farm's never going to pay you $1 million back.
Yeah.
Um, so to see what I call the indigenomics at display, and also taking that as a part of what we're learning.
Mm-hmm.
We're not just learning how to build a catchment or a berm. We're also learning how to work with the land, work with the water to achieve it with very little investment on our part,
Right.
maximum results
Right.
on the earth's behalf.
Right. So you're not expending as many resources, but you're creating a lot of good in terms of the ecosystem benefits that you're getting out of it. So I want to hear more about water planning and like where this tradition comes from and kind of like who was able to engineer this. But I think first, like, it might be helpful to talk about kind of the why behind, the resurgence of this technology, and the why behind like water planting in general, and also about the something that we talked about before about how modern science is starting to approach or catch up to or have some understandings that have been in indigenous cultures and practices for millennia. And one thing that you mentioned to me was the wildfire. Well, I don't know if wildfire is even the correct word for it because, but the Calf Canyon fire of 2022 in New Mexico, that was the largest fire in recorded history in New Mexico and burned over 300,000 acres of land. And how this was the result of a prescribed burn, which is a practice from indigenous cultures that was appropriated and, applied in a way that led to this destruction. So obviously we're seeing, last year was the hottest year on record here, and we're kind of seeing that happen year after year. And we're seeing a lot of wildfires that are the most destructive that we've ever seen. We just had the LA fires. So can you tell me a little bit about what happened with the Calf Canyon fire and what are people doing wrong and how can people learn without appropriating the wisdom from indigenous cultures about what is the kind of holistic view, and that's a big question obviously, but like just in terms of doing prescribed burns, for example, like what should they have done and where does that learning come from in terms of understanding how the forest operates at a larger scale?
Yeah. Real quick, I just want to clarify, um, nothing personal, but I don't like I don't refer to what we're doing and refuse to refer to what we're doing as any sort of technology, just because technology comes from English
Mm-hmm.
language, and the way we understand words today and use words today when we say technology, I feel like it gives people a false understanding of something, and
Mm-hmm.
it makes it sound like something that can be bought,
Mm-hmm.
and what we're doing can't be bought.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of technology, we refer to it as a relationship.
Mm.
It's a relationship with the earth,
Mm.
water, and yeah. So just had to point that out.
Mm-hmm.
And besides that, I just want to make it clear when I say what I say, I'm not speaking for any indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm only speaking my own thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
my own feelings about things.
Yeah.
Um, but if other indigenous people can agree, then great. Um,
Mm.
but as far as the fire, the largest fire in New Mexico history, that was started by, uh, that was started by the the government. Um, the government plan uh, to do a prescribed burn, and they didn't just do one prescribed burn; they did multiple. I know of at least three prescribed burns that week that got out of control and turned into devastating forest fires. And they chose the hottest, windiest day to do it, which goes against all common sense, really. But like my family used to say, common sense isn't so common anymore. But as far as I know, the land management agencies, started doing prescribed burns because indigenous people were saying, hey, this is a way we used to maintain our forest to protect them against bigger fires.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's from what I understand that, the Forest Service people and the fire people of the Forest Service, they took that and said, okay, yeah, we're going to adapt uh, prescribed burns, and I've also heard them turn around and point the finger and say, well, we're listening to the indigenous people,
Right.
you know, but from what I understand, the indigenous people, especially in the Southwest, but Western states in general, but I think anywhere in the country or continent, they only burned, at late winter or early winter. They would burn during the cold season where there's more moisture, trapped in the ground,
Mm-hmm.
and there's more opportunity for moisture to fall. At least here in New Mexico, in the Southwest, we get most of our moisture in the winter through the form of snow. You know, so I know locally, the local burning practice is to burn in February here when the ground still got moisture frozen in it, or it's just now starting to thaw out, but there's still a good chance that we're going to have more snow and moisture.
Mm.
So the fire doesn't get out of control,
Mm.
you know, and I think that's pretty common sense, you know,
Yeah.
that,
It seems
yeah,
pretty obvious to maybe not burn in when it's getting to the hottest point of the year. Or I think the prescribed burns they did that you're referring to were in April, and it's already getting pretty hot in the desert in April. So yeah, I think you described it as, you know, doing a operation under anesthesia, um, or maybe you're referring to something else when you said that. I'm not sure.
I think you're thinking about, when we're talking about thinning.
Right. Yeah. 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 So another practice to prevent these large scale wildfires is to thin the forest, and you're talking about thinning the trees, but doing it at the same kind of time of year, um, so the
Yeah,
trees aren't damaged. Yeah. Go ahead.
most trees go dormant in the wintertime, you know,
Mm-hmm.
here, here where we have winter. Um, and so when the trees go dormant, they go to sleep. And if you have to cut limbs off a living tree, that's the time to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But these forest thinning projects, they go through a whole forest and they'll completely wipe out a lot of trees, but then they'll cut on every living tree in the forest,
Mm-hmm.
and they do it while they're awake.
Mm-hmm.
So immediately they start bleeding to try to close the wound. And, you know, at the same time, science is starting to show, how trees are connected to each other through their root systems.
Yeah.
Science is starting to show how trees, when one tree is injured, the other trees will try to support it.
Yeah.
And so when you have a collective trauma
Mm-hmm.
throughout the whole forest, it makes the whole forest weaker,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And then simultaneously they break up all the ground cover
Mm-hmm.
into piles and they burn it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they open up more ground to sun exposure at the same time as they're traumatizing the forest. And if there's a beetle, you know, outbreak, which we're dealing with all
Yeah.
over the area,
Yeah.
then those trees become weaker to
Mm-hmm.
those beetle attacks.
Right.
And I think that them bleeding their sap also attracts those beetles.
Mm-hmm.
So, it sets off this chain reaction, and then simultaneously the the forest floor is drying out more
Mm-hmm.
because there's no ground cover.
Yeah. Yeah.
And ultimately you're just what I see happening is they're just making the mountains drier,
Mm-hmm.
you know, to whereas, you know, our work with planting water, the goal is to saturate the mountain. And a wet mountain won't burn, you know.
Yeah. Some that's pretty, like you said, common sense isn't that common, but seems like common sense. Um, so I didn't give you a chance to talk about. We started talking about water planting, but we didn't talk about the history of Sacred Water Mountain Society and kind of where that work started. And I think there's an interesting genesis of where that comes from. So could you talk about how it formed and also about your goals and your work right now?
Yeah. So the Sacred Water Mountain Society was a result of Standing Rock. Um, there was a lot of people from northern New Mexico who went to support in Standing Rock. And after the situation in Standing Rock ended, we wanted to come back home and continue to do our part and to protect what we have here and, start addressing the problems that we have here. And also, we wanted to be able to do that from an autonomous position as far as we didn't want to work with any state, federal, or be under any sort of state, federal, or tribal government
Mm-hmm.
strings or control.
Right.
Um, and so it was my family and two other families indigenous to northern New Mexico that formed the Sacred Water Mountain Society. And we chose that name because in every culture around the world, the mountains are sacred.
Mm-hmm.
And not always, but 9 times out of 10, all the rivers start in the mountains.
Mm.
And we all know the importance that the mountains play in the overall water cycle of things. And because of that, and because of our communities here being mountain people and water people, um, we chose the name Sacred Water Mountain Society to not just represent what we're protecting, but also to represent who we are as people, and kind of uh, open it up to not be so exclusive, but more inclusive,
Mm-hmm.
um, to other families and individuals and communities who feel like we have a responsibility and a place in our mountains and watersheds
Yeah.
to help keep that balance.
Mm-hmm. And so, when you talk about the goals of Sacred Water Mountain Society, I know you've been working with Ruth and their team at Ecologic. Are you guys hoping to spread some of these practices in New Mexico, northern New Mexico, southern Colorado? And I think, from what I'm understanding, a lot of it kind of just starts with observation, with seeing what's already there, what's already been done in terms of these relationships with water planting. I guess part of what I'm asking is like, is there, do you think you'll eventually be able to partner with, the Forest Service directly to, or, it could be state government, it could be local government, or maybe just other nonprofits? Because I'm just wondering about how open people are, or if this feels like it's compatible with the infrastructure that we have already in terms of moving water around.
Yeah, I don't think it's compatible at all.
Yeah.
Um, right now, the state federal system is doing complete opposite,
Yeah.
and technically our work is illegal.
Mm.
Um, so, uh, about a decade ago, I thought that maybe I could try to work with the local forest agencies, and after a number of meetings and them trying to remove me from the forest on 3 or 4 separate occasions, um, we come to an agreement to disagree.
Yeah.
And the head ranger of the district I was working in at the time told me in his office that they can't support what I'm doing, they can't permit what I'm doing, but they can't stop me.
Mm.
Um, so that was a good place. That was a good place to come to, in my opinion.
Okay.
At least knowing that they acknowledge that they can't stop me. Um, so my main objective right now with this work is to, and our board's main objective is to get data. And right now we're in the process of getting LiDAR scans
Mm.
of one of these systems.
Mm.
And the university environmental scientist doctors we're working with just received some federal cuts from their funding university wise. So we're trying to overcome that hurdle. Um, once we have this data, it's going to be huge, and it's going to impact things in a very broad scale. Um, until then, we're mainly just focusing in the Rio Grande watershed. The Rio Grande provides water to millions of people from. So we're focusing here and trying to educate the people here, and especially the communities associated and connected with acequias, which are ways of irrigating agriculture land. Back in the day, it was just drinking water, even for the people. But these acequia systems are in danger, and our local communities are actively currently trying to protect these acequias. So we're trying to connect the dots between the acequias, the rivers that the acequias depend on, and the watershed which produces the river. And we're trying to connect the dots to the planting water. Um, and we're being really protective with what we're doing, especially the ancient systems protecting those places. And we're kind of withholding a lot right now just to work on collecting this data so we can share that with the local tribes and get their opinion and suggestions on how to move forward. But it's something we really want to kind of focus locally right now.
Yeah.
And if we can get the acequias, because we have a lot of different acequia communities here, just in Taos alone. And each acequia community is a government unto themselves. It's a very simple government because it's only dealing with making sure the ditches is flowing so people can use water to irrigate their field. But still, it's a legal government, and their vote and choices matter. And so if we can get the acequia communities to acknowledge and adopt planting water as a watershed management solution, then we can go over the head of the National Forest Service. And ultimately, I think the big victory would for the communities themselves to have control of the watershed management.
Right. Yeah.
For the water they depend on.
Right.
That doesn't work the same in other states where they don't have acequias. But I think with us focusing on that here, if we can achieve that here, then that can spread in a good way.
Yeah. What was an acequia? You cut out for a little bit when you were explaining. I'm not familiar with this term.
So the acequia is a ditch that brings water normally off of a river, spring, and it'll bring that water through a community.
Okay.
And so here in northern New Mexico, in New Mexico in general, here in New Mexico, the first Hispanic communities were interestingly Islamic.
Okay.
And so this word acequia comes from Islamic origin, and it's governed by the Islamic water law, which pretty much is very simple and very compatible with indigenous way of looking at water law, which is everything. Water is life. Everything has a right to water, human and non-human. And so these ditches were bringing water into these communities. It doesn't exactly look the same now as it used to, because now you have new communities built over old communities. And in some places you still have old communities. But these ditches, at one time, they ran to every house in the community. And so every household would have flowing water coming to their property so that they could drink and bathe and wash and water their animals and grow their gardens. Nowadays, it's mostly just for agriculture and watering animals. But still, we have over 200 miles of irrigation ditches in Taos County that bring waters off the rivers and into the communities.
Okay. I think when Ruth was using the term acequias when I interviewed her, I thought she was just pronouncing acacia with her British accent a little bit differently, and I didn't realize this is a whole This is a whole nother thing. So thank you for clarifying that. Now I understand what that's referring to. And so you said you're working in the Rio Grande right now, and that's your primary focus. But you're kind of hoping after this data is collected, and after you're able to, like, kind of demonstrate the efficacy of this relationship, that it will start to, slowly spread out, from this area. Yeah, that's really cool that you are. And the what you're describing about, it took you 5 years to get an understanding of the scale of water planting, and I assume you're probably just referring to kind of this region, in the Southwest even. So even understanding the bigger scale throughout the U.S. is, even kind of more of a task than, you or I can imagine right now. But I'm curious for if people are listening and, maybe they're in the Front Range, maybe they're somewhere else. Um, what would you suggest? Because you had some guidance from your great uncle here in Denver, but you really went out and were living, in relationship to the land, to understand these relationships, to understand water planting. Um, how can you what would you say to people who want to have a better understanding of these kinds of relationships, or to support the type of work you're doing, um, maybe directly or indirectly, or maybe in a way that they can just in their own community where they are? What would you suggest to these people?
Well, you know, I went last year on, I went traveling out east, to Ohio and different places to visit some of the mound cities.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I don't know if you're aware of those, but a popular, very famous one's called Serpent Mound, and there's a number of other ones, Fort Ancient, and
I've heard
well,
of. Yeah.
just in Ohio alone, there's 10,000 of these mounds documented, and
Okay.
I call them pyramid cities because
Mm.
that's what they are. Um, but these pyramid cities exist all. I mean, there's millions of them.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, Minnesota has a documented 12,000 at
Mm.
least. So I mean, there's thousands of these cities all over the east, all the way into Florida,
Mm-hmm.
all the way down into Oklahoma and Texas. And all these pyramid cities are placed along river systems.
Mm-hmm.
And what I went there to see, I was suspicious if these pyramid cities were planting water.
Mm.
And after going there and looking, and also at looking at some LiDAR data that was recovered on some of these cities, I'm pretty confident that these pyramid cities are planting water.
Mm.
On it, it you can find things that look very similar to what we find here,
Mm.
but it's a lot different because you're dealing with less mountains, and they were more dealing with the river flooding cycle.
Okay.
So these cities were built to uh, take the floodwaters and move the floodwater around the landscape to saturate the ground
Mm.
and spread the floodwater out to give more water to everything. And you know, it's recognized that they were doing this for agricultural purposes, but it hasn't yet been recognized how that directly impacts the groundwater situation. And I didn't realize that Ohio has a groundwater issue the same way we have a groundwater issue here in the West.
Okay.
Um, and so for these places that are still protected, they could be learned from and actually be used again,
Mm-hmm.
to recharge the groundwater
Mm-hmm.
all across the country
Right.
in places where they haven't been destroyed or too disturbed. Um, so it seems to me that this planting water practice at one time was a very large scale practice. And, ultimately, I think people today, if they just, I mean, we have a very diverse population, but, I think if people can just take a moment to acknowledge the indigenous people who live where they live or used to live where they live,
Mm-hmm.
and also take a moment to like think and observe and look at how they did things,
Mm-hmm.
and also to rekindle that relationship,
Mm-hmm.
not from a point of view of trying to receive some sort of technology,
Mm-hmm.
but from the point of view to restoring a relationship. And you know uh, there's a lot of research happening in the Amazon jungle. There's a lot of data coming out of the Amazon jungle saying that, previously they thought the Amazon jungle was wild, natural.
Yeah.
And now science and also the culture of the indigenous people themselves is coming together to show that the whole Amazon jungle is a man-made garden.
Mm-hmm.
That's very impressive. That's very huge scale, massive scale,
Yeah.
right? That we didn't think was possible, that that we didn't comprehend and give credit to the indigenous people of being capable of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, the planting water stuff is equal to that.
Mm.
The scale is equal, and I'm pretty sure the people in the Amazon jungle, different places in that region, were doing the same thing. I'm pretty
Mm.
sure they were planting water. From at the data that I'm seeing coming out of there,
Mm.
I'm seeing stuff that lines up and matches with what we're seeing here.
Mm.
So the scale is cross continental,
Yeah.
and in that the doctors and environmental scientists that came out and have started to work with us, they're indigenous, um, Dene, Navajo people and Santo Domingo Pueblo people. And once they saw one of these ancient systems, they knew that once this data is out, it's going to rewrite history.
Mm.
And it's going to cause a splash,
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answered your question.
That did that. It was also a good way of a good kind of way of comparing the scales of the relationships with the land between, South America and, establishing the Amazon rainforests and these water planting systems relationships that you're describing. And yeah, I have heard I've heard references to the things that you're describing, but kind of connecting the dots there, I think is really interesting to talk about how, these are water planting is happening in Ohio at the site you visited. I forget what it's called. It's Serpent Mound. Is that right?
Yeah, and Fort Ancient.
In Fort Ancient. And also happening in the Amazon rainforest. And I like I've heard references to these places, and I've heard that a little bit about what you're saying about the Amazon rainforest, as well, being like a man-made garden. And it's just hard to fathom, I think, to wrap my mind around. So, but but it gives me a sense of the scale of what you're talking about with water planting. So it's
And
pretty
also,
fascinating. Yeah.
and also to give a little bit more understanding and scale to that,
Mm-hmm.
from what we're researching and studying, it appears, I can't say 100% yet, but maybe one day we'll have evidence, but it appears to me that there are entire rivers here in the United States that are man-made rivers.
Hmm.
Uh, some of them still flowing, some of them drying up
Mm-hmm.
because they're no longer being managed that
Right.
way, or the ancient planting water systems are being bulldozed
Right.
through for roads, houses, and all this stuff.
Right. Wow. I mean, it makes sense in terms of like if you look at how beavers can reshape the hydrology of a land so extensively, why couldn't people do the same to an even bigger scale? So it makes sense. It doesn't seem like it's really that much of a stretch.
I
And
think we learned
yeah, yeah,
we learned this work from the beavers.
yeah, yeah,
Nature taught us everything we know, whether we
yeah,
know it or not. And I think the people observed and saw, how the beavers did things,
yeah,
and also through observing beavers myself for many years out in the land. From my own observation, I realized that beavers are very strategic.
yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
we think that they'll just build a dam anywhere, but they won't.
Yeah,
They're really strategic where they build a dam,
yeah,
and they're also strategic on how they do their work. Have you ever noticed when a beaver cuts down a massively giant tree
mm-hmm,
that is way too big for the beaver to ever move,
mm-hmm,
right? How do they move that tree? Why do they cut down that tree if they can't move it?
yeah,
Well, I've seen that they cut down the tree and make it fall
yeah.
in a specific way to where when the river floods, it picks the tree up and puts it into place.
Wow.
And so I don't think we give beavers as much credit
Yeah,
as they deserve. Um, but I think the people observed this and they realized, okay, they noticed and learned from the beavers. Why did they choose this location and not that location?
right.
And they also, and they took that outside of the main stream system or river system, and they spread it into the ravines
Mm-hmm,
and runoff points throughout the mountain watershed.
mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of I've seen some articles about it. I saw like a video about it, I think, as well. I think it came out of the Netherlands where they were planning this project to um, dam this river in like 3 different spots. And so they had a proposal and it was going to cost like $2 million or something like that. And then be like in before they could actually start this project, a family of beavers came and dammed, this took people a lot of research, a lot of time to plan. They dammed in those exact same 3 spots and saved the city like $2 million. And I think this was just like last year that I was reading about this, but people were just amazed that like how did the beavers know to do that? But as you're saying, it's humans that learn from beavers and not the other way around in terms of how to like re-engineer the kind of hydrology of a river and of a land. Well,
Yeah.
we only have a little bit of time left, so I wanted to give you space to. Is there anything else that you wanted to share that we didn't get a chance to talk about? Because I asked all my questions and you answered them graciously. So is there anything else you wanted to share?
Um. Uh. Well, we've had a scheduled work season, and it ends the first week in June.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I would invite people to join us or reach out. But every year we're gonna have something going on.
Okay.
we don't do YouTube videos.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we want to pass. If we do teach people what we're doing, we want to pass it down genuinely, hands on. There's just so much you can't learn from a screen.
Yeah.
Um, so we're really hands on people, really face to face type people. And, if people are interested, they can reach out to us at Sacred Water Mountain Society at gmail.com.
Okay.
And yeah, if there happens to be any experts in hydrology or mathematicians who understand how to record water data,
Mm-hmm.
or archaeologists or anthropologists, if there's anyone who might see this who is interested in supporting our efforts to collect the data we're after, um, we would love to hear from you and see how we can work together.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sitting down for a conversation to talk about water planting and the work you guys are doing. And do you guys, so when you're talking about going out into the field, would this be in the Taos area? Do you ever come up to Colorado, either the western slope or even the Front Range, for any of this programming?
I have received some invitations around Denver,
Okay.
Stone, and different places along the mountains. And if we receive an invitation,
Okay.
yeah, we'll come up.
Okay, cool. Well, I would love to go out and see this firsthand to learn for myself as well. So if you have anything this summer, it sounds like it's maybe already too late, but in the future, whenever you guys have, it'd be cool to see.
Well, if you reach out to us,
Yeah.
this is pretty much my full-time
Yeah.
thing. So if you reach out to us, we can schedule a time.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I'd
Awesome.
love to meet you in person. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like the show and follow wherever you get your podcast. Special thanks to Ruth Macera for introducing me to Dustin for this episode. For additional features like video, you can find transcribed versions of this and future episodes at my personal Substack, Echoing Earth. The music for this podcast is Siesta by Ixon, part of the Tell Your Story project, a library of free music for content creators. Visit ikson.com to explore the full catalog.